If you look at two examples, if you read the Anglo-Saxon media and you Google Belt and Road Initiative, you only get the negative stories. So you get a negative story about China building a port in Sri Lanka, which the Sri Lankans couldn't afford, and therefore it became an untenable debt for Sri Lanka, and the Sri Lanka then had to cede the port to China. And the argument there is that China was obviously exploiting Sri Lanka. But actually, if you look at it objectively, in some ways the Sri Lankans got the better deal because they got a whole port without spending any money, and now China has to manage the economics of the port. So actually Sri Lanka benefited from that deal, what was supposed to be a mistake. And similarly, clearly there were some mistakes made also in the proposal to build an east-west railway in Malaysia, right? And there were allegations of corruption involving the former Prime Minister Najib, and there were some problems there. But once again, when the new Prime Minister came in, Dr. Mahathir came in, China and Malaysia worked out a new agreement, right? So this shows how China can adapt and be flexible. And it's also important to realize that there are some remarkable success stories in the Belt and Road Initiative. One, for example, for many years, it would take the citizens of Uzbekistan several days to cross from one side of the country to another because there's a mountainous terrain in between. But then the Chinese came along and they built a fast train in 900 days. And that's a remarkable gift on the part of China to Uzbekistan. So these positive stories are not told. And you've got to understand, that's why 137 countries agree to join the Belt and Road Initiative, because they also want to have fast trains, modern ports, good highways, good airports in their countries. And China is now #1 in the world in infrastructure. So paradoxically, even though I lived in New York for 10 years.
We are sorry to interrupt you. Before we move on to his next point about New York, we noticed that a lot of you are returning viewers who have not subscribed. If you've enjoyed our content, subscribing would mean the world to us. It's a small click for you, but it makes a huge difference for us. Thank you for your support.
Even though the United States is obviously a more developed and a richer country than China is by far, if you want to see a first world airport, you go to Beijing. If you want to see a third world airport, you go to John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City. And that's stunning, isn't it? If you want to see a high-speed first world train, you see the train within Shanghai and Beijing. If you want to see a third world train, take the Acela between New York and Boston. You know, that's a paradox, that the world's richest country has a third world infrastructure when China, which is still a relatively poor country, has a first world infrastructure.
I just spoke to a couple of people from the African continent, one from Nigeria, one from Kenya, and they were talking about, and to your point, in Kenya, you know, this rail system, it's one thing to give aid to a country, but now if you've got a product and you can get on a train and get there quickly and sell your product before it rots, it's the same sort of thing you were talking about with Uzbekistan. They were saying that they think perhaps the reason China's, and I want to get your thoughts on this, China's relationship with the African continent is different than the United States is because China's still, as you said, a relatively poor country. It's a developing country in a sense, although it's a major power. But it's gone through this development in recent years. It's kind of been in those shoes, whereas the United States is so removed from that, they see things differently. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and you know, it's actually a tragedy that when you read the Anglo-Saxon media on the relations between China and Africa, you read again only the negative stories about what China is doing in Africa, and none of the positive stories come out. And whenever somebody asks me a question about China and Africa, I say that I respect the Africans' ability to make their own decisions on what is good for their societies. And so if China hosts a China-Africa summit, and all the African heads of government and African heads of state turn up for the summit, they are voting with their feet to show that they have confidence in what China is doing in Africa. And at the end of the day, And certainly it'd be good for the rest of the world to also invite, it'd be good for the United States to invite all 54 or 53 plus African heads of state to come to Washington, D.C. too. And also make the same kind of offers that China makes. That would be very good for the world. It'd be very good for the world to see the development of Africa, and especially very good for Europe to see the development of Africa. And in fact, logically, it should be Europe that should be cheering Chinese investment in Africa. But unfortunately, since Europe is often geopolitically deferential to Washington, D.C., it has not been cheering Chinese investment in Africa.
You mentioned all the negative, none of the positive. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it is very difficult, I guess especially for what I call the Anglo-Saxon mind, to conceive of a world where the world's number one power is neither a Western power nor an Anglo-Saxon power. And if you look at it objectively, in the 19th century, the UK was the number one power, Anglo-Saxon country. In the 20th century, United States was the number one power, Anglo-Saxon country. In the 21st century, it's very clear the number one power will be China. In fact, the 21st century will be an Asian century. And so the sense of loss, the sense of not being in power or in control is very powerful, very deep. And so there is a lot of resistance to accepting a world where the number one power is no longer Anglo-Saxon. And I think there's this deep psychological reluctance to accept the fact that the world has changed fundamentally since China, India, and the rest of Asia have come back.
What do you guys think? Do you think he is right about China Belt Road Initiative? Please leave your comment below. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you for making it this far. If you like this video, you might want to share it with a like-minded friend. Thank you, and as always, stay blessed.